Let's dive into a bit of a refresher on some of the important information security concepts and terminology that's going to come up time and time again throughout this course. And the goal here is not to just throw a bunch of terms at you for memorization, but to gently introduce some of the foundational concepts of what it means to work in a SOC. But also, some of these concepts might actually get thrown at you in interviews, so it is best to have a solid grasp on them. But if you've been pretty familiar with everything so far, or if you have a background in security, well, you're going to breeze right through this section, and if not, don't worry, because we're going to hopefully fill in those gaps for you here. So let's start out with something we've briefly mentioned in the previous lesson, the CIA triad. And this triad is a foundational concept in cybersecurity that represents the three core principles of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And essentially, any security control or process or tool that you implement within your organization is aimed to protect one of these principles. So let's cover them a bit. Let's talk about confidentiality. And this is going to ensure that information is accessible only to those who are authorized to access it. And we can implement many security controls that focus on protecting the confidentiality of data. And most often you'll see it associated with encryption. So if you're not familiar, that's going to be converting the data into a form that can only be read or processed after it's been decrypted using an appropriate key. Therefore, if someone who is not authorized or does not possess that key gains access to the encrypted data, well, they won't be able to read it. And honestly, we use encryption all over throughout our environments and even within the SOC. For example, we're going to need to encrypt data stored at rest, things like hard drives or backups, or like log archives from our SIEM, or even data in processing in transit. For example, right now, you're watching this video, you're accessing it through an HTTPS protocol, which is the web protocol that integrates TLS, or transport layer security, that introduces encryption within the connection. But there are other controls related to confidentiality as well. We can think about access controls, like access control mechanisms like authentication and authorization processes, basically anything that can restrict access of information based on a user's identity, roles, or any other attributes. We can also tackle this from a process side, right? So we have data classification, for example. So we can classify data stored within the organization or within its systems based on its sensitivity level. For example, data might be categorized as public, for internal use only, or strictly confidential. This classification helps us determine the appropriate level of protection and access controls that we need for each type of data. Next, we have integrity, and integrity ensures that the data remains accurate, complete, and also unaltered during its storage, transmission, or even its processing. So this is where we protect data from unauthorized modifications, or deletions, or insertions, whether it's accidental or malicious. And this comes into play a lot actually during digital forensics, where we need to document a proper chain of custody of evidence and be able to prove and present that the evidence that we submit has not been tampered with. And often we do that through hashing algorithms and things like write blockers to prevent modifications. We're going to get deeper into that, of course, during the digital forensics section. But we can also implement things like audit trails that keep detailed records of data access and allow us to track changes and allow us to identify any unauthorized changes. And lastly, we have availability. And this ensures that information and resources are actually accessible and usable when we need it. And commonly, you'll encounter controls such as things that prevent disruptions or denial of service attacks, because of course, these compromise the availability of systems. But realistically, so many different things could be a disruption to availability. We can think about a server failing, or an internal DNS or a proxy going down, which prevents employees from accessing a certain website that they need. Or maybe accidentally implementing an oversensitive endpoint rule that's going to block access to an important business application. Next, we have the AAA framework, which is also known as the Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting Framework. This is a model that is used to securely control access to resources and services and provides a more structured approach for managing user interactions on a system. And like with many of the controls we talked about, the ultimate goal of the AAA framework here is to ensure that only authenticated and authorized individuals can access specific resources. So we have authentication. And of course, this is the process of verifying an identity of a user or a system entity attempting to access a resource. Basically, it ensures that they are who they say they are. And we have different authentication methods, right? We have things like passwords or key-based authentication using public key infrastructure, or even things like biometrics, right? Fingerprints or facial recognition. And we can provide multiple sources of authentication at once to create more security, or also known as multi-factor authentication. Next, we have authorization, and this determines what actions or permissions or what resources a user is allowed to access after they've authenticated themselves. And typically this relies on defining an enforced access policy based on specific user identities, roles, or other attributes within the company. So we're looking at things like access control lists or role-based access control. And lastly, here we have accounting, which is also known as auditing or tracking, and essentially it involves logging and monitoring user activities within the system. So it records details like who accessed what service and when, for how long. And often accounting is really crucial for meeting compliance standards, but it's also just as important for security event monitoring as well. And we can use things like native audit logs, as well as monitoring tools like our SIEM, to record user activities and implement accounting. So next, let's make some important distinctions that often come up when talking about security operations. And sometimes the terms that we're going to cover here are used interchangeably, which is a common misnomer because they're related, but they have distinct meanings. So we have a threat, a risk, and a vulnerability. And let's talk about how they differ from each other. So to put it simply, a vulnerability refers to any weakness or a flaw in a system, a network, an application, any kind of asset that could potentially be exploited by a threat actor to compromise anything within that CIA triad, right? So we can think of things like software vulnerabilities, right? Coding bugs or coding errors or design flaws. Maybe configuration weaknesses like improperly configured systems, default passwords, or unpatched software. But there's also human factors as well, right? So human errors or negligence, or even just a lack of awareness can lead to security vulnerabilities, like someone falling victim to a social engineering attack. A threat, on the other hand, refers to any event or even an actor themselves with the potential to exploit vulnerabilities within any of the organization's assets. So threats don't have to just be a malicious individual, maybe like wearing a hoodie in a dark room and launching attacks like malware or ransomware. Right? This can come from things from inside the company. Things like technology failures or natural disasters, or even the organization's own employees, which we would call an insider threat. And while a vulnerability exposes the organization to threats, the threat actually takes advantage of a vulnerability, which leads us into risk. And risk is the potential for loss or harm or damage resulting from the exploitation of vulnerabilities by threats. It really does, as you can see in the diagram, represent the intersection of vulnerabilities and threats and the assets or resources that they target, because a risk is realized when a threat exploits or harms a vulnerability. And oftentimes, organizations and security teams will perform risk assessments that evaluate the likelihood and impact of potential security incidents. And we consider things like the threat likelihood. How probable is it for a threat to exploit a specific vulnerability? As well as the impact severity, right? So what is the magnitude or the consequence from this resulting action? As well as the asset value. So what kind of data is at risk? What kind of systems and infrastructure? How critical is it? And we're going to talk more about risk in a bit, but let's move on to some more tangible concepts that as a SOC analyst, you'll be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So let's start simple. Let's talk about a log. And we can think of logs as a chronological record of events, actions, or any transaction that occurs within a system. At a high level, a log is going to provide us as analysts and auditors with detailed accounts of any activities or changes or interactions as they relate to a system or the interconnection of systems. There are countless log sources out there and many that we're going to cover, so this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but we can start thinking about things like system logs or application logs or maybe network logs that, document network traffic or connections. So let's take a look at an example log from a web server's log file. The following log you're seeing here has been extracted from an Apache web server's access log file. So we can actually break this down section by section, right? We have the IP address here at the start. This is the public IP address of the system that made the request to the web server. We also have a timestamp here, right? We get the date and the time of the request. Next, this string is going to be the request line. So we can actually break this down farther into the HTTP method or the GET request. We can see the requested URL, that's /admin.php, as well as the protocol version, the 1.1. And next we get the status code. So in this case, it's a 200, meaning that everything was okay. But if we were to get something like a 404 not found, or maybe like a 301 redirect, this would give us more information in terms of how the web server handled this request. And lastly, here we have this weird string. This is a user agent string. And it can actually tell us many things about the request or the source of the request, including the browser that the requester used, as well as the operating system used for the request. So we can actually take this IP address that we discovered and perform a lookup to identify where the request came from geographically and what service provider the IP address belongs to. This, of course, can be useful information during an incident response investigation, and it can help us trace the origin of any suspicious activity. And like with the IP address, we can take that user agent string and actually parse it using tools to determine a lot of information that we talked about. So we can extract some valuable information about the user who made this request, such as the browser they used, the name and its version, the operating system they're running on, as well as the device type. Is it a desktop, mobile, tablet? And many other additional details. So let's talk about a security event. So a security event is any occurrence that has the potential to impact the security of an organization's informational assets or infrastructure. And security events can be defined as a wide range of activities, right? So we can think of things like failed login attempts, or high volumes of network traffic, or a user attempting to run an unauthorized program on their workstation. These may not always turn into an incident, but they should still be investigated nonetheless, right? All incidents are events, but not all events become incidents. Which brings us to a security incident. So an incident is a confirmed or suspected breach of any kind of violation of our security policies, or procedures, or controls that we have in place. And ultimately, this poses a threat to our confidentiality, integrity, or availability of our organization's assets. So again, all security incidents are events because they involve some sort of observable occurrence. However, not all security events escalate to security incidents. And next we have an alert. And an alert is a notification or a warning generated by a security monitoring system or our tools that indicate a detection of a potential security incident. And alerts are typically triggered based on predefined rules or thresholds or even patterns that we set up to indicate potential malicious activity. Security alerts will often include important metadata, things like the event details or the alert context. Alerts are also typically categorized based on their nature and severity, right? Are they a high or critical alert and require immediate attention? Or are they more low priority and still require attention, but do not pose an immediate threat to the organization? For example, let's take a look at a Snort alert that was logged to our SIEM. Snort, which we'll cover later on in the course, is a powerful open source network intrusion detection system. And when we look at the alert here, we can see, like with our log example from earlier, some information that we can extract, right? So we have the date or the timestamp. This is the date that the alert was triggered. We have the priority, in this case 1, which may indicate a high alert severity. We have the protocol, which is UDP. The class or the classification gives us some more context and detail into what the alert entails. And we have the source IP address from which the suspicious network traffic originated from, as well as the port, and the destination port and IP as well. We also get some more information with the SID or the signature ID, which is a unique identifier for this rule that we can then look up to get more information. We then have the description here, which provides a, of course, description of the alert, indicating in this case that Snort detected an inbound connection related to the zero access Trojan. So next, let's talk about security controls themselves and what types of controls we can decide to implement within our organization. When we start to implement security controls that complement and support each other, we aim to achieve the concept of defense in depth. And this is a strategy that involves deploying multiple layers of security controls and access controls within our organization to protect against a wide range of security threats and vulnerabilities. And this is a strategy that involves deploying multiple layers of security to protect against a wide range of threats. So rather than relying on a single point of failure or a single security measure, defense in depth will emphasize the redundancy and diversity and depth within our security defenses to create a more overlapping protection layer. And we can think of the Swiss cheese analogy in which we stack multiple layers of Swiss cheese slices on top of each other. And if you think about a Swiss cheese slice, it's going to have individual holes or weaknesses that threats can exploit. But when we start to stack layers on top of each other, over time we end up patching all of these holes holistically. And when it comes to controls themselves, typically you'll see them separated into 3 distinct categories. However, we're going to see shortly that this can get confusing and kind of arbitrary. So first, let's talk about administrative controls. And these relate to the policies and procedures and guidelines that we implement within an organization to manage and mitigate security risks. So for example, we might have incident response plans or security policies. We might provide things like security awareness training. We might implement access control policies. And we also have technical controls, and these are also referred to as logical controls as well. And as the name suggests, these controls rely on technology to enforce security policies, and also do things like detect and prevent unauthorized access. So we can think of things like firewalls, our endpoint detection and response platforms, intrusion detection systems, or even things like introducing encryption, access controls, antivirus software. The list goes on. And lastly, here we have physical controls. These are tangible measures that we can implement to protect physical assets or our facility and resources from unauthorized access or even theft or damage. These controls encompass security measures designed to secure the physical environment in which the IT and security systems and infrastructure operates. So we can think of things like surveillance cameras and biometrics or perimeter fencing, access control systems, right? Or even hiring security guards. These are all examples of physical controls. Now, we can also talk about security control functions. And these relate to an actual control's, function or goal or objective. And so to start, we have preventive controls, and these are security measures deployed to proactively prevent security threats and incidents from occurring. So for example, we can implement things like firewalls or access control lists or EDR tools or intrusion prevention systems. And we also have detective controls. So these are measures implemented to identify and detect attempted security incidents. And these focus, of course, on monitoring and analyzing. So obviously in this case, we have our IDS systems or our SIEM, different log monitoring and analysis tools, and things like audit trails as well. And next we have corrective controls, and these are security measures implemented to remediate and mitigate the impact of security incidents after they've been detected. So these controls focus on restoring systems or data or operations to a secure state and prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. So we can think of things like having secure backups or incident response plans or having a patch management system in place. Which brings us to deterrent controls, and these are used to, well, deter threats from exploiting vulnerabilities. So we can think of things like placing warning signs or physical barriers or tamper seals to prevent tampering. And lastly, we have compensating controls. And these are alternative security measures that we can implement to mitigate risks when a primary security control is either impractical or ineffective or just plain unavailable. And these controls serve as substitutes or even enhancements to primary controls that achieve the same or similar level of security. And often when we're evaluating compensating controls, we need to have a process to accept and document carefully for auditing and compliance purposes. So we can think about using network segmentation as a means to secure sensitive and legacy endpoints from the rest of the network, right? If we have a very old system that we cannot patch, we physically cannot patch it, well, we need to have compensating controls in place. Maybe we air-gap the system because it can't feasibly be updated. You might have noticed that certain controls can fit into multiple categories. For example, we have surveillance cameras, right? Is it a physical control? Well, I mean, yes, it relates to physical equipment. But when we think about functionality, surveillance cameras can fit as a detective control, right? Because we're able to use them to monitor and detect for attempted security violations. But they can also be classified as a deterrent control, as the mere presence of having them can discourage physical intrusion attempts. So it's entirely possible that a single security control can fulfill multiple functions. So let's quickly talk about risk again. So SOC teams employ a range of strategies to manage risks effectively. And these strategies encompass various approaches. So we have things like transference or risk acceptance or avoidance and mitigation. Each strategy that we're going to talk about offers distinct advantages and is applied based on the organization's risk appetite or resource availability as well as business objectives. So first we have risk transference, and this involves actually shifting a financial burden or responsibility of managing a risk to another party, typically through some sort of contractual agreement or policy. So instead of directly dealing with the risk, an organization can just transfer it to a third party that is better equipped to handle or absorb it. So a common example that you'll see is purchasing cybersecurity insurance. By paying a premium, we can transfer some of the financial risk of the potential security breach over to an insurance company. We can also think of things like moving services to the cloud, right? When we move things to the cloud service providers actually abstract a lot of the physical and some logical controls away from us. So by paying a premium to shift things to the cloud, we gain a lot in security, as well as many other things that cloud providers offer. We also have risk acceptance, and in this case, it involves acknowledging and continuously deciding to tolerate or live with a certain level of risk without actually taking any actions to mitigate or transfer it. So this strategy is appropriate when the cost or the effort required to reduce a risk kind of outweighs the potential impact of the risk itself. So for example, in some cases, organizations might choose to accept certain operational risks. They might accept a minor service disruption during routine maintenance rather than implementing some costly redundancy measure to eliminate downtime altogether. Right? That's not the best example, but it's often this balance of resources and time and cost, as well as the impact. We also have risk avoidance. So this involves taking deliberate actions to eliminate or avoid specific risks altogether. So with this strategy, we aim to completely remove the possibility of encountering a specific risk, thereby preventing any potential negative consequences. For example, an organization might decide that the risk of data breaches associated with storing sensitive customer data is too high. Maybe for a simple e-commerce site, an organization doesn't need to be storing financial data for longer than necessary just to complete a transaction. So they put controls in place to only keep that data ephemerally. And lastly, here we have risk mitigation, and this involves implementing proactive measures to reduce the likelihood or impact of any identified risk. So for example, we can implement things like a strong patch management system or plan to mitigate the threat or the risk of threat actors exploiting vulnerabilities. or maybe a strong redundancy plan to mitigate data loss and system failure, which would of course impact availability. Okay, we're almost done. Let's quickly talk about security policies along with a non-exhaustive list of some common policies that you might see. So, security policies are documents that outline an organization's guidance, principles, and procedures for protecting its assets. So these policies typically serve as some sort of framework that establish and enforce security standards or define acceptable behavior, as well as ensure compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. So we use security policies to provide that clear direction to employees and contractors and stakeholders within the company on what their responsibilities are for safeguarding the company's assets. So for example, we have acceptable use policies. And these define acceptable behaviors and practices regarding the use of an organization's IT systems. So basically what is and what isn't allowed within the organization. And additionally, sometimes you might see this through a separate policy called Bring Your Own Device policies, but there are policies that can address the use of personal devices as well, and establish rules and security measures for accessing the company resources from personal devices. Next, we have the password policy, which you're likely familiar with, as these establish the requirements and best practices for creating, managing, and securing your passwords within the organization. So it includes things like guidelines for the complexity and length and expiration or even reuse of passwords. Next, we have data classification policies, and these categorize informational assets based on their sensitivity, their criticality, or confidentiality requirements. So it will define classification levels like public or internal or confidential, restricted, and specify specific security controls and protections that are required for each of these classification levels. We also have change management policies, so these outline the procedures and protocols for implementing, reviewing, and approving any changes to IT systems or applications. It defines the roles and responsibilities and establishes a change control process to mandate documentation as well as testing requirements to minimize any disruptions or errors or any vulnerabilities that might be introduced because of these changes. So for example, in an ideal world, we should have a process to document a record of every asset's initial state, along with every record of change like an upgrade or an installation or a replacement. Because of course, change can bring in new risks to the organization, and the grand purpose of any change management process is to minimize that risk. And lastly, here we have a disaster recovery policy, and these establish the strategies and overall objectives and procedures for recovering any IT system or data or operations and infrastructure in the event of a disruptive incident or disaster. And so it's going to outline the roles and responsibilities of key personnel. It's going to identify critical systems and resources and define things like recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives to adhere to. And through all this, a disaster recovery policy is going to help the organization ensure business continuity, minimize downtime, and also mitigate the impact of unforeseen events on organizational operations.